to enable English subtitles. For this video, please locate and press the subtitle button on your remote control or device interface. Subtitles are a valuable tool for enhancing your viewing experience, allowing you to follow along with the dialogue and understand you've probably seen it before, whether in real life or on our Reptil TV or in advertisements, no matter what products, colors or paints that you see or encounter in your daily life and experiences. The panther chameleon is misused for advertising everywhere because it has such amazing, intense colors. The colors are also relatively easy to maintain. Take good care of them. They're great terrarium animals. In this case, a male. The males are definitely more colorful, more appealing and spectacular, although there are also pretty females. That's why today my intro animal for you is a panther chameleon. You might remember my intro animal a few episodes ago. There was a spiny-tailed iguana that bit down so affectionately on my finger, and it really held on to it, not because he didn't like me, but because he really wanted to be on TV or on the internet when I promised him we're doing an episode about spiny-tailed iguanas for your sake. Then he finally let go, and that's why I have to keep my promise. Today's episode is about the spiny-tailed iguana, Varanus acanthurus, which is from the same lineage as the one we had back then, a super beautiful red ecchi. Ecchi is derived from acanthurus. Acanthurus ecchi is the abbreviation for red ecchi, and for me, as an introductory animal today, it's the spiny-tailed iguana episode. I mentioned earlier a bit about the spiny-tailed iguanas. They come from Australia, from the northern part of Australia. Now we need to rethink. Australia is in the southern hemisphere, and the northern part of Australia is the hotter area, the dry desert. There are similar areas up there in the north of Australia, and it stretches from the east to the west this way. Depending on which direction you're looking at it now, mirrored, the spiny-tailed iguanas have a huge range. It stretches over more than 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers from east to west. Accordingly, they are incredibly variable. There are countless different colors, and there are populations that are larger and some that are smaller. That's indeed really an enormous complex. It's not so easy to say. They all tend to be larger animals. About 60 centimeters of the 60 centimeters, about a third head, body, and more, or just under 2. A third tail. That means if I have an animal that's 60 centimeters long, then it has about 20 centimeters of body length up until last year. It was assumed that Varanus acanthurus has 3 subspecies, but this has now been re-examined. Several Australian scientists took a look at this and conducted a new study based on DNA. And the result from that, to sum it up, is that they suggest it should be divided into 4 species. 4 species that belong to this Varanus acanthurus complex. Let me read it out quickly. Where do I have it? So here I have it. Varanus acanthurus, Varanus insulanicus, Varanus storri, and a newly described one. Also in this work, there's a Varanus citrinus. This citrinus, interestingly, is also the smallest representative from the acanthurus complex. We'll show you the link below on YouTube. Who is interested in reading through that? It's 2001. Relatively long, but interesting. In the end, there are also maps showing the distribution areas, so it's an interesting contribution. I can recommend it to you. Take a look at it with us. In terroristics, because Australia has an export ban or stop for many decades, I believe we haven't been able to find any more animals probably be able to say exactly, oh, they are from this area or this species or subspecies. In terroristics, people tend to talk more about the colors. What we saw earlier at the beginning was the juvenile animal, the red one, a red eggy, and now here I have a yellow eggy. And then there are also the animals that are more brownish, or solid brown. Those are the browns. In terroristics, we differentiate between these three colors, with the reds being the most popular. As in general, in terroristics, yellow is also very beautiful. The browns are the ones where people try to breed in more color. Those are the distinctions that you encounter in terroristics. To tell you a bit about the animals from Australia, I always find it interesting when you know something about the area of origin. We terrorists always think we know a lot, but it's really great when you have information from the area of origin. I have been in touch with Ewan Edwards, who has been in Australia for decades. I've known him for over 30 years. We met in the USA, met at the Reptilien show, or rather, he worked there for a while. He's a terrorist through and through. He has been living back in Australia for decades now, keeping and breeding spiny-tailed monitors there. I had written to him and asked him to give me some hard facts about the acanthurus, which I would like to read to you a little bit now. So he writes that the burrow is always under a rock, below a rock on the ground. So they probably dig themselves in and they take the stone or rock away as protection. They build their tunnels down there. The entrance to these hiding places is always facing east, I assume towards the east. It probably has to do with the sun, because this way they might get the best sunlight. Or I can only explain it to myself with the sunrise and sunset, which is why the east is predestined for the entrance. These burrows of the acanthurus can be up to 1 meter deep, or I can only explain it to myself with the sunrise and sunset, which is why the east is predestined for the entrance. These burrows of the acanthurus can be up to 1 meter deep, usually around 60 centimeters deep. Be also interesting for the terrestrial aspect. Definitely they need to have access to a 60 centimeters deep or tunnel, or the possibility that they dig themselves in. Probably 20 or 30 centimeters would be enough, but it seems to be important for them to be able to burrow in there. It's always humid in the burrows. I think that's really important for terroristics. So we put moss in those hiding caves, and they love to hide in there. They go into that moss cave to sleep every night. I think that's important. Then the Juan writes, in winter they are all the way down in the burrow. Of course, the colder it gets, the deeper it gets, the more they hide away. Spring and autumn are relatively warm at the entrance on hot days in spring and autumn. Could it also be that they come out of the burrow? They don't just stay hidden for 4 or 5 months at a time, but rather when it's hot outside, they also like to come out sometimes and do a bit of sunbathing. He writes that they always have their same routes, so from their hiding spot, when they come out from their burrow, they always take the same routes and have their sunning spots there, and probably also their hunting spots where they hunt, and you would really notice that they always take the same paths. And you would easily recognize the caves of the acanthurus if everything around the cave is more or less clean. You can see the tracks around the burrow, where they go in and where they come out. He says that there are always these paths around the caves. These are a few Australian facts, and I think it's really interesting for us as terrorists to hear it firsthand. We already talked about keeping spiny-tailed iguanas in the first episode. Really just a top-notch animal. It's a sun worshipper. Very bright, very hot, best with HID lighting and LED. Maybe to get a bit more brightness, basically like a bathing game, very hot, very bright terrarium, 1.20x 1.60 meters, which meets the keeping guidelines that exist. So you can really keep spiny-tailed iguanas well. They are truly a great terrarium animal. They are not overly difficult to keep. They take to food well, by the way. They are pure carnivores, so they only eat insects. You can offer them some salad or fruit, but they won't eat it. They feed exclusively on animal protein or feeder animals, feeder insects. Here I have a young one. It's about 2 months old now, 2nd month old. The spiny-tailed iguanas really grow quickly. At 2 months, they are already a decent size. They reach sexual maturity at just over a year, so that's relatively quick. They have a high metabolism depending on how long their winter dormancy lasts. But if you do a normal winter dormancy, I would recommend 2 or 3 months, then they will be mature in the 2nd year. They become sexually mature in the 2nd year. In the 2nd year, you can breed them well, but watch for dominant animals that may suppress or bite others. Separate them if needed. We raise young ones in groups of 4 to 6. If one gets aggressive, isolate it or pair with larger ones. As adults, keep them in pairs, like bearded dragons. One male with 2 to 3 females often leads to fights. If we notice that someone is starting to act a little crazy, then they are more or less put in solitary confinement or with someone bigger. When the animals become adults, it's best to keep them as pairs, like with bearded dragons, for example. One male and 2 to 3 females often doesn't work well either, because the females sometimes fight among themselves and start to get aggressive. So I would recommend keeping them in pairs if you want to breed them. It's a bit tricky to determine the sex when I have a pair like this in my hand. I think then everyone says that the one with the slender head is the female and the one with the strong head is the male. You can see it relatively at a glance. The problem is you have a single animal and then it starts all over again. Is the head more slender or broad? It's all relative when you don't have a comparison. Everything you know seems easy to say, but say that when you know it. When you have a single animal or two that look similar, that's when it gets tricky. It's not so easy to tell if they are males or females, even with the hemipenes. Also, the females can have a relatively thick base of the tail after the cloaca. It's also difficult to tell, just like with bearded dragons. Females can also have a relatively thick base of the tail after the cloaca. You can't really tell, just like with bearded dragons. It's also difficult to say. So I believe I look at the base of the tail. If I look at it this way, I wouldn't trust myself to do that either. Just by looking at it, no, not at all. With the female, you can see 2 bulges, which has worked quite well for us. With subadult animals, like my starting animal, once they're that big, you can probe them. But the probing has to be done by someone. Probing is a delicate matter, so don't start doing it at home. You can't just probe and start poking around. It really should be done by a good reptile-savvy veterinarian. The average veterinarian hasn't learned this in their training, nor from a monitor lizard keeper or anything like that. But in my experience, probing works really well and reliably with spiny-tailed iguanas if you know how to do it. That can be a good method. Just to wrap up on breeding, if you have such a great Aki pair that gets along well, the stimulation happens through the winter dormancy. I mentioned it briefly before, so they have a winter dormancy of about 2 to 3 months, even in the wild. In Australia, according to Ewan Edwards, they have a relatively short winter dormancy. So these are animals that are active in the fall, and they are also animals that come out relatively early in the spring as soon as it gets warmer outside. There are other reptiles that go into winter dormancy at the first shadow of the sun and only come out when it's really hot. So they're not, like I said, they have a shorter winter dormancy. Accordingly, we do a winter dormancy of 2 to 3 months in terroristics, during which we take care of everything. We just put in fresh water. Is the cool room temperature perfect, or is it okay? Okay, and then you can hibernate them in the terrarium as our animals do. To part 2, clutch in the year 1, relatively or somewhat soon after the winter dormancy, spiny-tailed iguanas lay about 10 to 20 eggs. The second clutch, a few months later, is usually significantly smaller. They are of course, egg laying like all monitors. Oh, and as we discussed in our incubation episodes, we do it with heat collared, and then the pretty little monitor babies come out. Really a great terrarium animal that breeds well and is truly a lot of fun